I want to take a minute to tell you about the person that we'll be interviewing Geraldine Brooks. We have Nikki Galland, who is a local author here, but also a published and very respected and successful author. She has 5 historical novels, including I, Iago and The Fool's Tale. Her other work includes Stepdog, which is for sale out there. It's a contemporary comedic novel, and it's a bestseller. And she's also a best-selling. She also has a best-selling alternative history trilogy called The Mongoloid that she wrote with 6 other authors. She lives on Martha's Vineyard. She's the co-founder of Shakespeare for the Masses at the Vineyard Playhouse. And she writes a tongue-in-cheek advice column for the Martha's Vineyard Times. She comes by her writing with impressive credentials. She's a Harvard honors grad. She won a full fellowship for graduate work at UC Berkeley in dramatic literature. She was the literary manager at Berkeley Repertory Theater and a dramaturg at California Shakespeare Festival. So she will be both, first she will introduce Geraldine Brooks, and then she will interview her. So thank you very much, Nicole.
Thank you. Hello. Geraldine, I'm sure most of you know many things about her, but I'm just going to do a little quick bio. She was born in Sydney, Australia, and she began her life as a journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald, writing features articles, especially on environmental issues. She went to Columbia Journalism School on a scholarship, and after graduating, married her classmate, Tony Horwitz. No small feat. Together, they covered crises in the Middle East for the Wall Street Journal, and in 1990, they won the Overseas Press Club Award for best coverage on the Gulf War. She continued to work as a foreign correspondent until the mid-1990s, when a brief stint in a Nigerian jail made her reflect on her career path, and maybe we'll have a chance to chat about that. And then she turned to writing nonfiction books, starting with 9 Parts of Desire, which was her experience among Muslim women in the Middle East, which was an international bestseller and translated into 17 languages. Then she wrote Foreign Correspondence, which was based on her relationship, the pen pals that she had as a kid that she later went on to seek out. That was also an international bestseller and the winner of the Nita Kibble Literary Award. Then she decided to start writing novels, which is an awesome thing. Her first one was Year of Wonders, which came out in 2001 and was an international bestseller, followed by March in 2005, which, as most of you probably know, won a Pulitzer Prize. It is a retelling of the story of Little Women from the point of view of the absent father. That's not entirely accurate, but... People of the Book came in 2008, which won the Australian Literary Fiction of the Year Award. And then in 2010, she was awarded the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Lifetime Achievement, which is a little early for that, because there's plenty of life left. In 2011, Caleb's Crossing came out. That has a lot of meaning to all of us because it's set on the vineyard. And also that same year, her Boyer, I meant to ask you how to pronounce that. Boyer lectures that she wrote in Australia, sorry I'm being so inarticulate about that, were published as a nonfiction book called The Idea of Home. And that is incredibly beautiful reading, and you must add it to your to-read list if you haven't read it yet. Then last year in 2005 came The Secret Chord, which is the story that we're going to start talking about this evening. And her most recent honor, just last month I think, was she was made an Officer of the Order of Australia. So she's a dame from down under. On top of all of those fantastic elements of her career, she is also a really remarkable resident of Martha's Vineyard. She adds an awful lot to being here. She is generous, kind, gracious, righteous, unpretentious, and just an all-around fantastic person to have in this neck of the woods. She gives Washoe Shores a good name. So thank you all, and Geraldine, please take the stand. We rehearsed this, can't you tell?
Thank you, Nikki, for that. I think I should just go home now.
We're just starting. There are so many questions. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to sort of hold you accountable and ask questions in front of other people where you can't like change the subject and start talking about all the other brilliant things you could talk about. I have some questions here that I hope you will use as a jumping off point, and feel free to wander. The first one has to do with inspiration for the Secret Chord, and I don't necessarily mean the initial inspiration, although I'd love to hear about that, and I'm sure everyone else would as well. But the process, it's sort of a craft question, the process by which you went from thinking, oh, King David, boy with harp, kind of cool, to now I'm sitting here and I have an outline and this is a novel and I'm really going to write it, and this is the story that I want to tell. Because that process, surely you have more ideas for novels than you have actually written as novels.
So I think that the awful truth about ideas for novels is that you tend to get them when you're in the really, really gnarly part of writing the book at hand. And it's a bit like a long marriage. You know, you're enmeshed in this thing. There was the great attraction that brought you to it, but subsequently you've learned that this is the guy who drops the towel on the floor when he comes in the door. And all the truths about the project that you're working on have become apparent to you. And then it's like you go to a party and that guy across the room is looking at you. And you would love to look back, but you can't because you have to leave with the one what brung you. And you know that one across the room would never drop a towel on the floor. And it's all going to be easy and effortless, and you can imagine exactly how you're going to tell that story. And it's, you know, it's just like this horrible little voice in your ear. If only I could get done with this book and get on with that easy one. And then you marry it, and the towel is on the floor again. So that's a sort of long-winded way of saying the idea for the King David book came when I was very enmeshed in Caleb's Crossing, and the idea for Caleb's Crossing came when I was completely swamped by people of the book. And that's always the way it goes, and you're in the, you know, the most difficult part of writing the book at hand, and then you get this idea, first Native American graduate of Harvard, and he lives on Martha's Vineyard. That's going to be a snap. King David. Wow, everything happened to that guy. Look at this. I only knew about Bathsheba and Goliath, and there's all this other stuff, and I can't wait to tell it. And then you realize there are no written sources outside of the Bible, and you've never worked on anything where there weren't tons of diaries and letters where you could hear a voice and get the vibration of their souls, and all you've got is Samuel, which is fantastic. It's beautifully written, so why did you think you could do it better? Yeah, and then the agony sets in.
So to go back to the question, sort of, was there just one guy across the room, to use that metaphor? Or were there several?
No.
And then how does that one end up being the one that...
It's usually just the one. I guess I'm a serial monogamist. Yeah, and you know, in the middle of David, I get invited to Plymouth Plantation by some very nice people who have this great idea for a book, and you know, the minute it was out of their mouth, I knew it wasn't a great idea for me, because I'd already written that book, which was Caleb's Crossing, which is in the voice of this Calvinist, you know, early settler, and I didn't want to do another Calvinist early settler, and so I'm nodding and smiling politely, and there's this other guest at the table sitting kind of over there, and I can hear him telling this incredible story about he's just taken this skeleton of a horse from the Smithsonian where they didn't know which horse it was, and then they found out which horse, and holy cow, what an amazing horse. And I'm going, could you shut up so I can hear what he's saying?
And that's what you're working on now? Yes,
Yeah.
Excellent. You sort of anticipated my next query, which was, so many of your books have this very richly researched historically specific information that you have to draw on, and there's less of that there's just less of that for King David. So not only what did you do to make up for the absence of that, but how did it feel different? I mean, did you feel like it was a different kind of project, and how did it feel different?
So there was this terrible panic when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to do what I knew how to do, which is read everything from the time and place until you can hear it, until you start thinking like that, until you start using those words around the house and your kids are looking at you like, "A pox on you, you rake-shamed fanfaroon." That wasn't going to happen with biblical Hebrew. And then I had to figure out another way to do it. But it turns out that was very rich, because I decided that this would have to be researched experientially. So I went through the story and found every place that was associated with David. And we went there. I took my youngest son, because I love exploiting my kids as research assistants. They're great. They don't see things in the kind of jaundiced way that we do. They ask the questions that we wouldn't think to ask. And I guess, my favorite moment with my son, who is then 10, is David was, when he was in one of the many reversals of his life, when he's on the run, the King Saul has turned against him, and he's a hunted outlaw, and it happens that he's a hunted outlaw in the caves of Ein Gedi, which happens to be quite near Masada. And so we climbed Masada, and my 10-year-old is sprinting ahead of me up the rocky scree, and I am laboring behind him, feeling just like King Saul must have felt, as the fleet-footed David was always eluding him. And we get to the top, and it's just when there's a tour group there. Wonderful tour guide from the IDF is talking about how when he, as with all the soldiers, they hike up Masada in the dark, and they're there for the dawn, and then they take their oath with their rifle in one hand and the Bible in the other, and they vow that Masada will not fall again. And I'm completely verklempt. And, I'm still moved as we are making our way down, and my son turns to me and he says, "Mum, I don't get why he was saying that about Masada will not fall again. Who would want it? There's nothing up there." And you try to explain national metaphor to a 10-year-old, and you realize that that's a good reason to have him along, because he questions everything. So we herded sheep and tried to figure out why being a shepherd is such a great entry-level position for future kings of Israel. and things of that nature. And then I'm trying to figure out, how did David actually conquer Jebus, which became the city of David, Jerusalem? How did he do it? Because nobody had managed to do it. And so it's the IDF. There are people who have thought of everything, and I got this guy who is a strategic thinker in the IDF, and he went through all the things that could have been possible. And
that's great.
So there are ways to research something that are quite different. So it was
in theater we call that method acting. You were method writing.
And there are things that haven't changed. The way the light changes over the Dead Sea when you're looking at across now Jordan, then Moab, that was what David would have seen, that light, that mist. So you take how can you connect with somebody who maybe lived 3,000 years ago? And that's how you can do it, by smelling the same herbs on the hillside and feeling the heat of the sun in the afternoon.
That's
and that
beautiful.
kind of thing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Through when you were doing that, so you had the two. You sort of had you had the Old Testament, and you had this sensory experience as the two primary things.
And all these wonderful experts, because there's nothing that you can ask that somebody can't answer. Like when they say he played the harp, what kind of harp might it have been? And what was the tonal scale in early Hebrew music?
That's great.
Yeah.
So, given the other material in addition to the Old Testament, through what lens did you find yourself examining the Old Testament itself? What muses were hovering around that suggested that you needed to treat it a certain way or not treat it a certain way? Did you think about it as a sacred text, or did you simply think about it as source material?
I thought about it the way we think about it at the Martha's Vineyard Hebrew Center, which is, we've got these words, they're very old. People have been grappling with them for thousands of years. Let's see what juice we can squeeze out of them this Saturday. And you bring to it every bit of experience you have and every need you have that particular Saturday, and you squeeze it and you squeeze it and you get the juice that you can get.
That's a great metaphor. Moving on to what is within the book. Natan, who is the narrator, is Nathan, as most of us know him. Natan is a little different than many of your other characters in that he is more of a witness than a protagonist per se. I mean, he's very strong and he's very clear about what it is that he believes, and he definitely speaks truth to power like all of them do because they're all so righteous. But he is more of a chronicler of events than an instigator or sort of a first responder. And I'm curious as to how you came to decide to position him that way.
So it was in Chronicles, actually, where there are two references to the book of Nathan. And it says the acts of David, first and last, are told in the book of Nathan. And I thought, holy cow, where's that book? And we don't have it, obviously, and it's interesting to speculate. Is it sealed up in a jar somewhere in a cave that hasn't been uncovered, or is it, as somebody at a reading suggested, locked away in the Vatican archive because the Catholic Church doesn't like what's in it? That guy's been reading too many
Dan Brown novels.
Dan Brown novels, exactly. So, but it's missing, and then you think, well, who is Nathan? Nathan's a Hebrew prophet. I love the Hebrew prophets. They're exactly the kind of difficult, thorn in the side, stone in the shoe kind of agitators that I'm drawn to, the people who make us better as a society by telling us the things we aren't ready to hear. And so, Nathan comes into the story of David at a couple of key points, and one of them is to basically tell David that he sucks, that he has betrayed himself and all his ideals by committing adultery with Bathsheba and then murdering her husband. And he's the one who calls the king to account. And so you read that and you think, what is the career path for that guy? And you think, well, most people say that to a king and that's the last thing they ever say, but who's there at the end? Who's there arranging who's going to be the successor on the throne? It's Nathan and Bathsheba. So something happened in the intervening time between these two. This woman who was taken from her home by force, in my view, as a woman. I mean, what choice do you have as a young woman if the king calls for you? And yet somehow on that unprepossessing foundation, she managed to build the relationship that allows her to be the one who's putting her kid on the throne, even though he's way down the line of succession. And Nathan is the one who's organizing it for her. So, very intriguing character. Yeah. And yet he's a brief sketch in Samuel, so you have to create a backstory for him.
It's a wonderful backstory. It's very, it's a fantastic mixture of watching crazy battles and it's very sort of Game of Thronesy. I think that's been said before. I don't think I get credit for
it did cross my mind, and I'm sure it crossed George R.R. Martin's mind too, because it really is. It's all there, the family struggle, the dreadful psychopathic characters, Amnon and Avshalom, the morally lost oldest sons, who reminded me of Saddam Hussein's sons, Uday and Qusay. You know, I mean, I couldn't write these books without having been a journalist for so long, and you draw on those experiences. And I certainly, as I'm reading about Amnon and Avshalom and the terrible things that they did, you know, Amnon is so morally lost he rapes his own sister. And, you know, this is dark even by Game of Thrones. Yeah.
Yeah. What got left out? Was there something that you found in your research or as part of the story that you desperately would have liked to have kept in that you could not figure out? Like if there was a director's cut, would there be added bonus material?
Yeah, The Witch of Endor. I love The Witch of Endor. You know, Saul at first loves David and brings him into the family, and then realizes that his children love David even more, and that his son is giving up his inheritance to David, and his daughter is betraying her father in order to express her loyalty to David. And so Saul is bereft, and he, having banned sorcery, goes to a sorcerer and has the sorcerer bring up the soul of the prophet Samuel. And it's so cool, but I just couldn't figure out how to do it.
Thank you for sharing that, though. So, speaking of your being a journalist, I have a question that I've often fantasized getting to ask you, and I'm delighted that I get to right now. You don't believe in writer's block. You have said this on numerous occasions, and you've attributed
Annoyingly, I'm sure.
No, I'm very susceptible to it, so I'm fascinated to hear that there are ways around it. But you attribute that to your journalism training. And you have a great anecdote that I would love you to share about when you were at the Sydney Morning Herald and your boss was standing over you.
Yeah, so this was my first really, really big story. I mean, I wanted to be a journalist for so long, and from the time I was 8 years old, actually, and I sort of bent my whole academic career towards making myself desirable to be hired on a newspaper. And I thought, well, they have a lot of politics and they have a lot of arts coverage, so I did a double major in government and fine arts and came out tremendously well informed about Quattrocento wall painting in Italy and classical political theory, and they sent me to the sports department. Finally, after I got out of covering the greyhound races, which is really the last redoubt of the most desperate punters in the world, I got to write some real news, and my first big story that was obviously going to go on page one was a really terrible story about a mine tragedy where some coal miners had been killed, and I'd driven down there and done my first, what we call in journalism, death knock, where you go and ask people about the people they've lost. And I came back and I was so determined to do justice to this story, and I'm just, sweating blood as I'm typing and trying to put everything that I've got into this story. And I had a news editor who was beyond crusty. I mean, you could have knocked on this guy like a 6-day-old baguette. He was so hard. And he's walking around behind me saying, "Where's the story? Where's the story?" And I'm saying, I'm just trying to figure out how to end it. And he yells, "End it? End it? I'll end it." And he leans over my shoulder, and we had a typewriter in those days, and he goes, "E-N-D," and pulls the paper out of the typewriter. And that was how we rolled.
So here's that was the setup question. The real question is, when you are alone in a room without the editor standing over you saying, "End it, end it," I mean, all you have to do is open any book you've ever written, and those sentences are crafted so beautifully and with such care, and you take the time. So you may have learned the discipline from being a journalist, but there's something else that's going on when you are alone in a room with yourself and the time. And that discipline must be coming from somewhere else, because it's creating a different kind of writing.
It is different, but it's not so much that. I just think most of what we do isn't very good, and that's just the fact of it. So you sit down and you don't get it right. And I Sarah Z, who is a sculptor who comes here in the summer, some of you may know, she had the best description of process that I've ever heard. And she said her process is mess, 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 art. And you can't make art every day, but you can make a mess every day. And you have to have the discipline to sit down and make the mess. Because if you've got the mess, you've got something there to work with. But if if you can't make the mess, then you haven't. And I just think, we don't have metal press workers block, and we don't have hairdressers block, and we don't have proctologists block. So why are writers the only ones who get to not work? You have to work, even if what you're doing is just making a mess.
Okay, thank you. Now it all makes sense. So I'm curious also, in the course of your own career trajectory, the moment between Foreign Correspondence and Year of Wonders, did you decide that you wanted to be a novelist, or did you encounter a story that you suddenly realized this has to be told? How did that shift happen? That reinvention isn't quite the right word, because you were obviously already a writer, but the sliding from nonfiction to fiction.
So I have to say that the Nigerian secret police are responsible for that. And it's the absolute truth. It sounds ridiculous, but it is true. I loved being a journalist so much. I loved every step I took. I mean, not every day. Sometimes it was just, terrible, terrible, emotional, dangerous work. But it felt like a privilege to be doing it, and I didn't think about ever doing anything else. And then I was in Nigeria reporting on Shell Oil Company and how they were in cahoots with the very brutal military dictatorship of Sani Abacha. And I was there because I was working for the Wall Street Journal. It was a fantastic paper in those days. And a television writer from Nigeria named Ken Sarawiwa had come to New York and been to see my foreign editor and said, this is what Shell is doing. And he had called me up and said, you should go and check it out. It didn't sound plausible to me. Why would one of the big 7 oil companies be behaving like this? But the allegation was that they had called in the military to fire on unarmed farmers who had been peacefully protesting the despoliation of their land. And so I went there, and it was worse than what had been described. I actually got there just after another massacre had occurred and talked to people who'd had machetes through their head and saw the bullets. And the poverty was harsh by the harshest yardstick of the poor world. These were people who had no clothes, no shoes, and billions of dollars in oil revenues had come out of that land. And not one clinic, not one school. It was the most black and white thing I had ever seen. And so I got all this testimony, and then, as you do as a reporter, I went to the Nigerian military to get their side of the story. And they handed me over to the secret police.
Wow.
And they threw me in the slammer, and I had no idea how long they were going to keep me. And I remember falling asleep with some difficulty on this hard concrete floor as the malarial mosquitoes buzzed around the lamp, and I said to my guard, could we turn out the light? She said, you can, but the mosquitoes will be worse. And I thought, of all the reporters I knew who'd been detained, and I thought of Terry Anderson, 8 years in a Beirut basement, and I thought, I'm 39 years old. If they keep me for 8 years, I forgot to get pregnant. And I realized that if I got out of there, that was important to me. And it hadn't crossed my mind, which is pretty slow thinking. But anyway, luckily they deported me after 3 days. And I got home and I greeted Tony with great enthusiasm. And our son Nathaniel was born the following year. And suddenly I wasn't the person that had the bag open in the closet, with the bulletproof vest in one corner and the chador in the other corner, ready for any call in the middle of the night to go anywhere. I didn't want to do that anymore, but there was nothing anybody wanted me for, because if that's what you've done for 10 years, nobody's going to think of you to go interview George Clooney or some, nice celebrity interview around a swimming pool under a waving palm tree. So that wasn't happening. And I thought, I need a new gig. And there had been this story that had been banging around in my imagination from 10 years earlier when we'd been hiking in the English Peak District. We came across a village where bubonic plague had come in 1665, and the villagers had taken the unique decision to quarantine themselves rather than do what every other single place did, which was flee for your life. And they had agreed to stay. And that had been such a powerful story to me, and I'd been thinking about it, and so I decided to sit down and see if I could actually tell it.
And were you aware that you wanted to tell it as a work of fiction from the
There
get-go?
wasn't any choice, because there was not enough material to write it as a work of nonfiction. So the only way to engage with it was through imagination into the voids. It was a village of illiterate lead miners and shepherds, and they hadn't kept any account of what it was like to be them. And the only letters that survived were a few letters from the minister who'd been the leader of the village, and that's all that there was. And so if you wanted to tell it, you had to bring some kind of informed, imaginative empathy to it.
Was there a moment where you thought, oh my goodness, now I'm writing, was there a transitional moment for you of...
So I had got this lovely award for foreign correspondence, and that was the Nita Kibble Award that you mentioned. And it's an award that was created by the first female librarian in the state of New South Wales, Australia. And she was given the job because they mistook her signature for a man's.
Wow.
And so she gave her estate for a prize to encourage women's writing. It came with $30,000, and I was extremely encouraged. And I decided that I would take this time that Nita Kibble had afforded me to see if I could write fiction. So I wrote 3 chapters, and I sent them to my nonfiction agent, and I heard nothing. And I thought, well, that's what I thought. It sucked, and she's too nice to tell me. And I better figure out how to, find a day job that I can actually do while I'm a nursing mother. And some weeks passed, and then the phone rang, and blow me down, she sold it.
Wow.
And this doesn't happen. This is silly. This is not, I was so lucky. And then I had no choice but to sit down and write the rest of it. And lucky me, somebody wanted to read it, so...
That's lovely. Thank you. I think I'm going to open it up to questions. Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, yes.
Sure.
Okay.
First of all, I love the book, and I read it before visiting the city of David in Israel this spring. My question is, did the Psalms inform the narrative, or did the narrative in the Bible inform the Psalms?
So the interesting thing with the Psalms is so many of them are described as a Psalm of David, and so many of them contain biographical information about him. So I'm inclined to think that he did actually author many of them, because otherwise we wouldn't know anything about his horrible childhood. It's in the Psalms that we find out that his brothers tormented him and that he was a very unhappy kid. There's nowhere else that is elucidated. So, except for the fact that his father, the kid vergessen, there's the one out in the sheepfold, So you get the impression that this is the very neglected and despised younger son. but it's mainly through the Psalms. And then the Psalms also are very informative about the state of his mind and soul after that confrontation with Natan, where he is brought to face with his moral failings and how he deals with them. That is the beautiful psalm that has the line, purge me with hyssop until I am pure. What you desire from me is a contrite heart. So I think it's a remarkable thing, because there's not many places where you can hear the voice of somebody who's been dead for 3,000 years. But I like to think that you can hear David's voice breaking through in the Psalms.
Thank you. Another question? Yes. There's the mic.
When you started to write fiction, what did you have to learn bereft of material that you'd always gathered as a journalist? Could you give us a concrete example of what you had to imagine, like in the interior life of individuals, the actual events? What do you remember a concrete sort of passage that you had to make in order to be able to write fiction?
So it happened in stages for me. My first book, 9 Parts of Desire, was 100% journalist's book. Everything in it is factual. It was based on my experiences living among the women of Islam, sitting with the Ayatollah Khomeini's widow in the weeks after his death, eating veggie burgers with Queen Noor in the royal palace in Jordan, just experiences that you had. And I thought, oh, well, I'll write them down and that'll be a book, but that's not how it works. I realized writing that book that I had to learn how to create a narrative line that would bring the reader with me on some kind of a journey to understanding. It's not good enough just to put incident and incident. That doesn't make a book. So I learned how to structure a narrative in that first book, which was very useful. Second book was a really strange little hybrid of a thing. It was part autobiography of growing up in Australia in the 1960s, which was a period of incredible social change, where the country went from being this misogynistic, homophobic backwater to turning out to the world and becoming one of the most progressive countries on earth at the time. And when that happens to you when you're 17, it makes you very optimistic, and I've subsequently learned it doesn't usually go that way. But so it was part that and part trying to reconnect with these pen pals that I'd had all over the world as an adolescent, and then finding their letters and going to seek them out and see what had become of them as adults. And one of them was actually right here on Martha's Vineyard. So what are the odds that a girl growing up in Sydney when she's 11 will have a pen pal in Menemsha? So I feel like I'm here by destiny and courtesy of the Mr. Spock fan club newsletter, which is where I got that pen pal. But so it was partly biographies of those people and finding, the Arab and the Israeli that I'd written to in Israel, and how all these people had informed the person I became later as a foreign correspondent. So it's called Foreign Correspondence because I was this little pen pal. And so that was a book where, and then the other theme in that book that I was totally unaware of until I finished it was really a lament for my father. I wrote it in the shadow of his death, and I found those letters because he had saved them. And it was about trying to understand my relationship with this very complicated, very strange guy. And I'll just tell you a quick story. When I was writing Caleb's Crossing, I was kind of thinking, I am totally guilty as a white Australian for the dispossession of the Aborigines, but I'm not responsible for what happened here with the Native Americans. And then halfway through the book, I realized that my great-grandfather, 6 back, almost certainly knew Caleb because his sister was the wife of the Latin master who prepared Caleb for Harvard. And why that hadn't been apparent to me was because my father changed his name when he was a young singer in Hollywood in the 1930s. And he ran away with Al Jolson's producer's wife, and his agent said, "You'll never get work under the name of Cutter again, so you better get a stage name." And he looked out the window and saw a Brooks Brothers. And that's how I got the name Brooks. Anyway, it was putting that book together that really loosened me up as a writer. It was like doing some kind of pull-ups that give you upper body strength so that I felt able then to embark on the next thing, which was a work of imagination. But I still couldn't do it without a historical coat hanger, if you like. I love to find these stories from the past where you can know something interesting, but you can't know everything, and to try and use imagination to fill those voids.
Yes.
There's a lot of violence in Secret Chord, and I had to put it down sometimes because it was just overwhelming. And of course I felt, well, this is sort of what's going on with ISIS and that kind of brutality. But why did you decide to fill the book with so much violence?
Because it was an incredibly violent life David lived, and you can't sort of write about it. You have to really confront it. I think it's the same with, if you're going to write about war, you have to talk about the reality of it, and you have to talk about the effects on civilians, particularly. When I was covering wars, I always wanted to not be in the front lines so much, but be with the civilians and see what happens when the troops move on. And so I kind of brought that sensibility to bear in writing this story. And to be honest, I was kind of horrified by how much violence there was. And I've always made this argument that historical fiction, I think there's a real divide in beliefs in people who write historical fiction. Like, are people from the past more like us or more different? And I'd always come down on the side of like, because it's the strong emotions that make us human. I don't think love felt any different. I don't think hate felt any different. The urge to be violent clearly isn't gone. Unfortunately, we're just as capable of the most insane and obscene brutality as anyone from that biblical era. But then you get to stuff in the text. I mean, the foreskin dowry thing was like, oh, how am I going to deal with this? Am I going to describe how they got the foreskins and how they counted them after that long trip back from the coast to the, yuck. And it really is so different. Who thinks of such a thing? And yet, that's the job of the novelist is to engage with unthinkable things. And it's very tough. I mean, I sometimes say if I hadn't written these books, I wouldn't read them.
The rest of us would anyway. I think we have time for another question.
Because we all have to go home and watch Trump and then shoot ourselves in the face.
Thank you. I loved the book and all of them. I'm curious to understand how this book is received by different audiences around the country, perhaps unlike the one we have here tonight. Some of the more fundamental Christians and Jews and Muslims. This is a very controversial book, and I would think it would be for some people who revere David as someone very close to God, and you bring him out into a very human, less than godlike person, which of course he was. But I'm curious to know how this is received in these other parts of the country.
Well, the wonderful thing about being a novelist is if people hate the book, they don't invite you. I mean, when you write nonfiction, sometimes you go and give a talk and half the audience has come to pick a fight with you. That doesn't tend to happen with novels. If people don't like it, they don't read it, you know. So it's a very good question, though. But I think, you know, my defense is, yeah, he's unfavorably portrayed at times, but so is he in the Bible. I mean, why would you try and whitewash it? And because Samuel doesn't whitewash it. The books of Samuel are very frank about David's failings. And the beauty of it is that this is a guy who fails, and then he tries to make amends, and he suffers terribly for his failures. And that's what the story is. It's about a full life, a complete life. He's not some plaster saint. He's all of us. The title of the book comes from the beautiful Leonard Cohen song, Hallelujah. And everybody knows the first verse. They say there was a secret chord that David knew and it pleased the Lord, which is a lovely idea, this idea of his musicianship being so powerful. But there's a lesser sung verse. You very rarely hear it, but it's got the line, there's a blaze of light in every word. It doesn't matter which you heard, the holy or the broken, hallelujah. And it's this idea of the duality of his holiness and his brokenness that I think is what makes people so fascinated by him, and that what keeps drawing us back to him, and why so many artists have portrayed him so diversely through the centuries, and so many musicians have written music about him, and you can find every kind of representation of him. I love, we all know Michelangelo's Menci perfection, but Donatello's effete little boy man who's almost surprised that he's got this Goliath's head in his hand. And then Caravaggio's streetwise thug, little tough guy, with his sort of dirty face and dirty feet, So I love that he's capacious enough to allow us to see him as we all are, complete.
Thank you. Thank you, Geraldine.